welcome to Solved, the political discussion show for people with attention spans and those looking to develop one. My name is Jay, and our other resident solvers are Amanda, Deon, and Erin, who will offer a greeting now.
Hey there.
Hello.
How's it going?
Collectively, we produce the venerable, indispensable, not to mention award-winning podcast Best of the Left, where humans, that's us, curate progressive media on a chosen topic, creating episodes that are greater than the sum of their parts. On this show, we use those same curation skills to pull together stories and ideas that help us solve some of society's biggest problems, because if we don't tell you how to think, someone dumber on the internet will. Today, we're looking to understand the assault on free speech and the media, as well as the history that made this moment easy to predict, as well as the larger context that gives some hope to the idea that it will be easier to turn things around than it might seem. Starting right off, there's a couple of articles that are getting at the same point. The New Republic wrote, "You think the Bari Weiss CBS News story is bad? No, it's much worse." And the New York Times article, "Larry Ellison is closing in on CNN, HBO, and TikTok." And I think that these two can basically be summarized by basically one quote from each. So on the relatively small scale, the specifics with Larry Ellison, it says, Larry Ellison is already a major stakeholder in CBS and Paramount. Now, CNN, HBO, and a major share of TikTok are in his sights. If all goes as anticipated, this tech billionaire, already one of the richest men in the world and a founder of Oracle, is poised at 81 to become one of the most powerful media and entertainment moguls America has ever seen. Given Mr. Ellison's friendship with and affinity for Donald Trump, an increasingly emboldened president could be getting an extraordinarily powerful media ally. In other words, the very last thing our country needs right now, end quote. And then the New Republic article gives us the big picture and says, quote, "The American media landscape will, within a generation or sooner, consist of a lot of large, noisy, avowedly right-wing outlets and a small handful of mainstream outlets that are too weak and feckless to defend what remains of our democracy, and will thus be acting as the handmaidens of their own destruction, if they aren't already. This is certainly an only in America story, but I do not mean that in the normal heroic sense. I mean it in the creepy, corporate, it's all about profit sense," end quote. So we're not starting on a light note today. Yeah, there are plenty of other places you could go to find all the details about Bari Weiss being put in charge of CBS, but you get the basic idea of the thrust of where we're headed, and that person is part of that. And I really just wanted to bring up Weiss to sort of highlight what bullshit the cancel culture scam has been from the right. And Bari Weiss basically became famous by riding that wave.
So after the election, I was reading a lot about Hungary for obvious reasons to try to get a sense of what was coming. And I read this Reddit thread where it was a Dutch person asking about Hungary and asking people from Hungary to tell them how things were going and how they'd evolved and get more insight. And the number one thing that people wrote about was the consolidation of the media as the tipping point. And this, of course, is not surprising. Like everyone knows that controlling the press gives you unbelievable power. But I did think to myself at the time, well, at least that might take a little while here. I just thought, I don't know, we have these big corporations, all these networks, it just might take a little while. So at least it won't happen super quickly. And of course, silly me. We're in month 9 and the consolidation of the media is not just happening, but almost complete at this point. And not only that, but throw in TikTok as well. And I've said this before, they have big plans. They have things that they want to do that we cannot imagine and we don't think about as valuable. This guy is 81. He's 81 years old and he's like, I want to consolidate all of the media of the United States. He's a vision at 81 for being the top media mogul in the United States and controlling the media. And he has a son who, of course, he will, pass all of this on to. But it is hard to remember the types of people we're dealing with and how differently they operate. And they had these plans ready. They were going to do them whether or not Trump won. But now that Trump is in office, the path is completely clear. In fact, they have the wind at their back. And, you know, they're winning. They're winning right now. And the only positive note I have for this moment as we start this conversation, and I think we will talk about this more later, is there is independent media out there. It is growing, and Best of the Left is one of those sources, and you should support your independent media.
The reason why it seems like this is happening so fast is that the media consolidation has been happening for decades. And
Mhm.
we've gone from, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but 80 some media outlets in the 80s to 5 corporations owning all media
Mhm.
as of very recently. And it could be 1 or 2 very quickly, but it's been a process that's happened over the last few years. It's just, it seems to have escalated because now it's just so blatantly, openly corrupt. Like, the consolidation of these corporations is completely dependent on fealty to Donald Trump. And I think that is the only major difference, because the consolidation, like Amanda said, they were going to do this regardless. We
Yeah.
had in the last administration, the best part of the administration, Lena Khan, kind of sounding the alarm bells about this
Mhm.
and pumping the brakes on it. But there's no one holding them back now. The only pushback is that, do you agree to do what the Trump administration wants? Do you agree to do press that he accepts? And if you do, then we'll put your merger through and you can buy this. And that, I mean, that is exactly what happened in Hungary. It's a great place to start. There's a name for it. I think it's called informational autocracy. These aren't
Mhm.
government run entities. They're third party entities, but they are adjacent to the government, and they have the plausible deniability that no, it's not government run. It's not like North Korea or anything, but it's not different. It's not as one to one. There is like this little small separation, but it's not really any separation. And when it does become so consolidated in so few hands, it is so much easier for them to actually control what is on all the airways. So yeah, like, independent media is going to be the way to go. That does cause some other issues because now you have to find your source. We're not all sharing the same information, and
Mhm.
the biggest sources of information are just disinformation. So the vast majority of people will be getting disinformation as their news diet.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the oligarchs are for. You can trace the dots almost one for one with how Putin controls Russia is he has a bunch of oligarchs who are sort of in his pocket slash, genuinely on his side or afraid of him or both. And they can control media entities. We're going to get to Russia later in the conversation. And there's talk about how a oligarch controlled corporation took over a media entity that was critical of Putin. Like that's all it takes. It's not complicated. The one that's really blatantly obvious and coming into clearer focus as time goes on is the push to force a sale of TikTok turned out to be a gift to Trump that he could use as leverage.
Mhm.
And so he could say, okay, we're going to delay shutting it down while I personally broker the sale. So he got to choose who's going to be allowed to buy TikTok, one of the biggest information portals, particularly for young people. And so clearly he's going to make sure that it is sold to an oligarch who is aligned with him. Like it's the most obvious thing in the world. So, yeah, that's how it's shaping up.
I feel like this is when I get super mad at the American narrative, if you will, because I don't know about any of you, but like anti-monopoly was heavy throughout my education. Like they stressed how anti-monopoly America is. And yet,
Mm. Mhm.
I mean, even at the time, there were huge conglomerates and it has only gotten worse. But the disconnect between these narratives and like what the actuality is in the country is ridiculous. I'm with you, Jay. I like Hungary as warnings and similarities, but I feel like the Russia comparison like sits a little closer to home, especially with the oligarchy.
Yeah, the turn we took away from trust busting,
Yeah.
breaking up monopolies is, I mean, like a huge stain on our history. And it's not part of the conversation we're having at the moment, but it was basically one dude's idea. Reagan tried to elevate this guy to the Supreme Court, partly based on his ideas. And at the time, he was seen as so radical that he actually got rejected. The US Senate rejected Robert Bork for being too extreme, and conservatives took that and learned the lesson of never ever allowing their Supreme Court nominees to not get rammed through again. They call that getting borked, turned it into a verb. And so he didn't get onto the Supreme Court, but his ideas precisely related to how the US should manage monopoly and breaking up corporations, like fundamentally changed the way we approach that for the worse. And we are living with the results of that.
And since we're talking about the 80s, the Fairness Doctrine and the dissolution of the Fairness Doctrine set us on the path we're on right now. And of course, it was a reaction by the right to the left actually being better at rhetorically trouncing them. I mean, to summarize. And so they were like, well, we can't have that. And so we're going to claim that it's a chill on free speech. And that will be our argument for getting rid of it. And in reality, they were just being beaten in the public square of ideas.
Which brings us to sort of our more major topic, the debate over free speech and the historical context that brought us to this point. So basically, the right pretending to be in favor of free speech is just another in a long line of examples of the right taking popular ideas from the left and twisting them to fit their own purposes. So, other examples, they came on board agreeing that racism is terrible, but refuse to actually understand it or teach it, have it be part of education, and are actively twisting it to make racism against white people a top priority for themselves. They came on board saying that discrimination is bad, but only after they figured out that they could claim that conservatives were being discriminated against by being told that they weren't allowed to discriminate anymore. The whole like gay wedding cakes and all that. And similarly, they pretend to adopt free speech, but only as a way of attacking the left while actually happily shutting down speech as soon as it suits them. So, to explain, that brings us to another New York Times article. The right didn't catch cancel culture from the left. And describing conservatives' view of the issue, it says, quote, it's the idea that the illiberalism that has swallowed the progressive left, what we often refer to as wokeness, has come for the right. The Free Press's Bari Weiss explained in the introduction to a podcast on the subject. And while conservatives are split over whether this is a positive development or a negative one, they all seem to agree on one point. The right learned its vengeance politics from the left. However, continuing, quote, the conservative movement that arose at the start of the Cold War readily married government power and private efforts to crack down on its political opponents. The article then goes on to describe the Red Scare blacklisting against the left in detail. Then there was the Lavender Scare, where anyone breaking from sex and gender norms were driven out of government jobs. It talks about attempts to create employment and housing protections for gay people, which then sparked a conservative campaign to repeal those protections. And then came the culture wars. So we're getting into the like late 80s, 90s. And it says, quote, culture wars politics led to campaigns against museum exhibits, rap music, federal funding for the arts, television shows, and Madonna, end quote. So like the trend on conservative stance on free speech is super clear. You just have to have been paying attention or look back just a little bit.
I mean, my whole childhood, that's what I remember hearing about was the, sanctity police who wanted to censor television and anything kids encountered. And, maybe as a child, I didn't see it immediately as a right versus left issue, but I certainly did as I got older because it was coming from the, Jerry Falwell crowd and the family values focus on the family people. And the right had embraced all of that thoroughly while having a zillion skeletons in their own closet at the same time, which was fun to uncover as the years went on. But because they cloak it in morality, and really this ties directly to the reaction to Charlie Kirk's murder, they are standing on a hill of moral superiority that, of course, they've built themselves, saying, you can't speak ill of the dead and, you can't say this on television, right? Like there was a kid show by that name, actually, a nice rebut to that very saying. And so trying to hold the high ground of moral superiority while clamping down on speech and then doing the exact thing that they claim to be against. Like none of it works. None of it actually makes any sense. The problem here is that we have the word cancel culture or woke cancel culture. And so there's been plenty of garbage drivel written about how this is just the same thing from the right. It is not. It is not the same thing. And if I had more time, I would write a long form piece on all of the examples of why this is not the same. But, one of the easy examples is they want to tell people how to feel about something and tell people that they aren't allowed to express how they feel about something, whereas the left was concerned about people being racist and violent. So those are a little different to me.
It's amazing how naked the lies are if you have been paying any attention at all. And I think that's what's scary about this whole thing to me is that they can just say, well, we're only doing it because the left did it, because they know that the vast majority of their base will just take it at face value and say, yeah, that has to be why we're doing it. And it's just revenge, and not know anything about the last, I don't know, 75 years in this country. Gore Vidal came up with the United States of Amnesia. Like, we just do not remember anything that ever happened in the past. The past has no relevance to today. We just move on. Everything
even 5 years ago.
Yeah. 5 years ago does it, like when when Joe Biden started COVID, like
Right.
that's the narrative now. Like it's amazing how easily they can just say, nope, this is why. And like you said, Amanda, you want to write this long piece about why it's not true. That's part of the problem. You need to add so much context and get people caught up
Who's
to
gonna read
speed to get people caught up so that they can have the information to know that, well, obviously this isn't true. This is something that the right has been doing since there was a right in America. They want to control what you think. They want to control what you watch. They want to control what you do, where you go, who you are, who you present to be. That's part of their whole project, and it always has been. This isn't new information. And to say because the left decided that racism is bad, sexism is bad, transphobia is bad, is the reason that now we have to make sure that you can't even say that you thought Charlie Kirk was racist when he was racist. That's not even remotely the same thing, but it'll work. And there will be people who just believe it and take it hook, line, and sinker.
I'm like kind of feeling something out as both of you are talking. But I was thinking about what's the difference between us viewing the Me Too movement, for example, as like actually just being repercussions for bad actions. Whereas it feels like on the conservative side, it's a repercussion of, quote, like being on the other team, being a Democrat, being, outspoken. It doesn't feel as authentic. The grievances that they air about these people, like, I'm like really hating the wording around Jimmy Kimmel. And I know we're going to get to that. But the fact that it's being phrased as something he said about Charlie Kirk instead of commentary he provided on Donald Trump's answer to a
Reaction, yeah.
Charlie Kirk question. Like even the framing of that. And then they do kind of win the narrative. Like they're kind of like America in their marketing. Like they're able to market even though they have really bad opinions. Like their arguments fall to pieces, but because they say it over and over again and they have the cue words, their audience eats it up and that ends up taking over. Whereas I think, progressives take their time. They want to have discussions. Like we want to have longer arguments. We're not as catchy. We kind of lose those things. And like the Charlie Kirk thing has kind of reaffirmed where they're kind of removing all of the context and just like blanket statements are being made about, oh, leftists are celebrating instead of like there actually being a discussion, which is what is happening.
Yeah. And look, this is not exactly the same. Obviously, this was a political assassination and not someone just dying of natural causes, but it wasn't that long ago that Antonin Scalia died. And the left celebrated. I mean, like, pretty openly. And there was a lot of conversation about don't live your life in a way that people celebrate when you die. That was the conversation at that time. The problem, I guess, or the layer of complexity here is that no one is on board with political assassination or violence of any kind for someone saying things. That's not, we're all not okay with that. That doesn't help any of us, right? But you can hold two things in your mind at the same time. You can say that was horrible, and also he was a racist, misogynist asshole. And those things are both true. And the right wants you to believe that they cannot both be true, that you must only have one favorable opinion of this man. And if you don't, then by default, you think political violence is good. And that is, of course, an absurd argument. And you're right, Erin, if they weren't so good at just hammering people and giving them what feels good, because that's, of course, what it is. That's why it works. It taps into all those emotions. We'd be having a more interesting conversation. The left seems to be the only ones having any conversation about what is going on and like reflecting and analyzing this moment. The right is moving right along.
I just want to add something to the Antonin Scalia idea, because it's probably not wrong to say that the left celebrated, but I don't think it is entirely correct to say that they were celebrating his death, because he was still in a consequential place of power when he died. And so imagine the difference of how you may have felt personally, anyone on this conversation or anyone listening, or just like how a generic leftist may have felt about the death of Rush Limbaugh or Henry Kissinger or Margaret Thatcher. Once these people were already irrelevant and then they died, you might have a feeling of, geez, that took too long, or, well, whatever, good riddance. But like celebration wouldn't, it just like, who cares at that point? Antonin Scalia dying is like, oh my God, we have a chance to change the balance of the Supreme Court. That's where the feeling of celebration would have come from. If Antonin Scalia had already retired from the Supreme Court and then died, no one would have cared. No one would have celebrated. It would have been a blip. So I just want to clarify that, like, in terms of people's reactions to the deaths of human beings, the power those humans have at the moment is incredibly relevant to how people feel about them dying. Like, the position that Donald Trump holds or doesn't hold will vastly impact how I feel about him dying when he eventually does. Of course, that's just the reality of it.
Trump isn't gonna die. What are you talking about? He's the
He's
strongest.
going to live forever.
Yeah. Whoa.
Apologies.
Okay.
Or just haunt us.
Yeah. Just because it was a funny point, Deon and I were talking yesterday, and we realized that Donald Trump has probably written a note that says, if I die of literally anything, it was not of natural causes, and he will
Right.
throw someone under the bus, because like nothing can ever be his fault, even mortality. And so he will want to take someone down with him.
Even
My guess,
mortality.
like, will he name Barack Obama specifically?
Probably.
Like Joe Biden
You
is just
heard
an
it here
extension.
first.
So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
Okay, but back on point, you may be wondering how conservatives came to frame themselves as free speech warriors when they so clearly have a history of being the opposite. This article continues. The right discovered political correctness. Of course, it's just the same as wokeness, but a decade or two earlier, same deal. It says the right discovered political correctness as a powerful charge against liberal inroads on issues of gender, racism, and sexuality. The right delighted in skewering liberals as the new thought police, priggish censors who sought to narrow the scope of debate in the name of inclusiveness. As these arguments gained traction in national media and a sympathetic hearing from some liberals, right-wing activists found new value in identifying with free speech. Placing themselves on the side of First Amendment rights helped counter the unpopular politics of right-wing censorship drives. End quote. So, it's such a mindfuck that they effectively adopted a stance of favoring free speech because they're so censorious themselves and unpopular because of it that they had to figure out how to turn the tables. So just like discrimination is the worst when you're discriminating against me because I want to discriminate, free speech censorship is the worst when you censor me for wanting to censor you. Same shit. So yeah, they were never really in favor of free speech as a concept, except to be used as a weapon against the left to try to stop, as the article says, the progression of culture away from narrowing the scope in a positive direction that honestly everyone would claim to be in favor of. It's the speech that I have dubbed on a recent Best of Left, anywhere you get your podcasts, I dubbed the umbrella form of speech being genuinely horrible to people. It's the racism, it's the sexism, it's the discrimination, it's the abuse, all of that. And the left is just, hey, let's stop being genuinely horrible to people. And the right screams free speech in response. But they have also adopted racism's bad. We shouldn't be racist, but curse you if you tell me I shouldn't say racist things.
I do think it's important to hit that note again that what they want to debate when they talk about free speech, what they want to discuss is other people's level of humanity. That's what they're using free speech for. They're not using free speech to talk about policy or like taxes. What they want to talk about is whether or not Black people are fully human.
Yes.
Hispanic people are fully human. Women have any rights at all. Trans people exist. That's what their free speech is about. The idea that specifically Charlie Kirk was a great debater, a free speech warrior. What his whole project was seeding the idea that Black people weren't fully human, fully capable, that trans people shouldn't exist. That's not free speech. That's hate speech, which is what we've said for a while. And there's no point in having these discussions anymore. Like that we should move on from that. But now we're back into debating whether or not I'm fully human, whether or not anybody here gets to be in opposition to the current regime. Like that's what we're debating now. And that's not free speech. And they can twist it however they want. But just know they aren't in favor of free speech. They aren't in favor of you speaking at all if you're listening to this.
And kind of in that vein, with how they've marketed the censorship that happens, right? When I see it on the conservative side, it's mostly wielding strong, powerful government agencies. So like how you see Trump threatening media companies, how you see media companies like absorbing and becoming monopolies, legislation that's passed to prohibit certain speech. Like they literally wield powerful government branches, powerful divisions of our society to implement censorship. Whereas like with progressives, especially, again, I'll go back to Me Too, you saw social pressure. I'm not saying we never use legislation, we never use any kind of government power, but it's a lot more from the people pressuring those in power to then act on their behalf. So it's definitely like more centered in people versus just top-down authority censorship.
Exactly. From the government, right? And yeah, this is going to be tough because I think we're all going to want to say the same things because you both covered what I was going to head towards. But like, yeah, whenever they say, and for instance, I believe Charlie Kirk did say that Joe Biden should be arrested and, thrown in jail for what?
And executed.
It's
So
and executed.
don't leave
Yeah,
that
I wasn't 100% sure that was said, but yes, you're right. I think that is what it said. And the next question would be for what? For what legal reason? And they pretend that they have been oppressed legally. Now, of course, I'm sure they're talking about COVID. I'm sure that's the main issue. But that doesn't even make sense because Joe Biden wasn't even president for the majority of those times. But the reasons for why they think that things were so bad under democratic regimes are actually cultural reasons. Like they are exactly what Erin was describing. It's because society under Obama, 8 years of Obama, had shifted, had moved away from their old, tired, racist, misogynist crap. And they felt unable to express their tired, racist, misogynist crap. Rightfully so, because we'd all moved on. But the presence of a Black president, apparently, and other things, but that was really the big one, like launched them into apoplectic states. And then, of course, we had the social media pushing all of it and making sure that everything that they were enraged about was on fire online. So everyone saw it. And so what they are actually angry about is that we made progress. The government did not come and tell you you can't say something. Society did. And, if a private social media company decided to, shut down your account, that's because they have terms of service. The First Amendment is not about private companies following their terms of service. It's about whether the government is oppressing you. And, I'm sure we'll get into this more later, but very recently, Google just came out and said, well, yeah, the Biden administration was pressing us to suspend certain accounts based on, the fact that they were spewing misinformation and disinformation about COVID, about the election, et cetera. And so it sounds like the Biden administration wrote a letter saying it'd be really great if you could not let people lie their asses off on your platform. And that's harming public health. That's harming integrity in our elections. Like maybe you could do a better job of keeping that in check. And they acquiesced because they were currying favor with the current administration. And now they're currying favor with this administration by saying, oh my God, they pressured us. Well, they pressed us. Like they told us a couple times that maybe we should reevaluate. And we just had to cave because we felt pressed. These are private companies. Grow the fuck up. And like that whole mechanism is not the same as the Biden administration passing laws or sending the Justice Department after people for things that they say. These are not the same thing. This is not in no way the same thing.
But they won the marketing on that because then what is reported? Yep. Woke mobs are pressing. Like they just come up with a language that infuriates the base and also brings, I don't know if we can call them middle ground conservatives anymore. Like pretty much everybody is part of the MAGA movement, but it pulls conservative independents over to it. And like they also catch into the woke culture wars. It's not the same thing. It's never been the same thing. It's just a cute tagline.
Yeah. If a private company wants to fire a woman who called the cops on a guy who was birding in Central Park, that has nothing to do with the government and the administration. It's that kind of stuff. Like, oh, she was canceled. She did a really shitty racist thing and spouted off about it and put a man's life in danger. And the company decided we don't want to be associated with that. Sorry, you lost that culture war. And I understand why they are desperately clawing and scrambling to get it back because they cannot handle the fact that they're not being oppressed by the government and yet feel bad.
There's nothing worse than feeling bad. That's what I've learned from conservatives over the last 5 to 10 years. They really don't like feeling bad.
No,
I wonder if it has to do with having felt extremely overly comfortable for way too long.
Yeah.
So with all of this deeply contradictory history laid out, this will be of no surprise from the New York Times. Trump administration wields its full toolbox to bring media to heel. And it says, President Trump received thunderous applause during his second inaugural address in January when he vowed to, quote, immediately stop all government censorship and bring back free speech to America. It was in keeping with the popular free speech refrain of his long march out of the political wilderness and his first term broadsides against cancel culture, which he called the very definition of totalitarianism. Yet, he is now conducting the most punishing government crackdown against major American media institutions in modern times, using what seems like every tool at his disposal to eradicate reporting and commentary with which he disagrees. End quote. Pause for gasp. Oh, wait, that was just in my notes. I wasn't supposed to read it. It also goes on to highlight Pam Bondi's comments. It says, quote, Attorney General Pam Bondi told a podcaster, quote, we will absolutely target you, go after you if you are targeting anyone with hate speech. And then she later amended her comments to say that she would not prosecute speech, but incitements to violence. And on that note, there's been explanation in some of these articles about relatively genuine free speech advocates being part of the conservative coalition, like a minority of it, but they are there and they are real. And as we sometimes do, we turn to the Babylon Bee to get like a sense of some of the aspects of the conservative movement that we may not see otherwise. And I did find it interesting that they wrote the article, Pam Bondi honors Charlie Kirk's legacy by doing exact opposite of Charlie Kirk, saying in the article, the best way to honor Charlie Kirk is by going against what he stood for, Bondi said in a subsequent social media post. Charlie was a relentless warrior who fought for the freedom of speech and the open exchange of ideas. That's why I'm making it my mission to police what people say, identify speech I don't like, and take steps to hold the perpetrators criminally responsible. It's a philosophy that is not at all what Charlie would have wanted. And in his memory, I'm going to make it a reality. End quote.
Broken clock.
They're a mixed bag of weirdos over at the Babylon Bee. But like, yeah, I find it valuable to know that I guess there are conservatives who really believe in it, at least in some aspects. Like they have a line. Like they would probably be in favor of shutting down some amount of speech, but they wouldn't call it that. But if you just come out and say it, then they say that's bad. And that's good.
Yeah, there are some people who do not want to be ridiculous hypocrites. And those people were the ones who came out and supported Jimmy Kimmel. And he actually thanked them in his monologue when he came back because, yeah, most of them don't care that they're hypocrites. Some of them do.
The joke is as funny as Babylon Bee can get, but the idea that Charlie Kirk was a free speech warrior is so frustrating. He had people monitoring professors for wrong speech, trying to get professors and universities fired. That he was not a free speech warrior. That is just a narrative that they are pushing. They have turned him into a hero when he was not. And I have no doubt that the end point of his project was that there would be no people left of center or left of the middle right in universities teaching. That's kind of what he was going for. It wasn't a free speech project. He was just yelling at teenagers. That's not a free speech warrior. But the concept of the joke, I get it, but it's frustrating to have him lionized as some sort of hero of free speech.
No, he was a propaganda machine. His entire organization is a propaganda machine. And, you know, I've read some interesting feedback from a couple different universities, and one was interesting in particular because this liberal professor had become a faculty advisor for one of the Turning Point USA groups on campus because they couldn't get anyone else to do it, and talked about how beneficial that was and what he was experiencing anyway with the kids who were in this group on campus. And it does sound like it's interesting. I'm sure this is not the case everywhere, probably far from it. But in this case, it seemed like the kids on campus who had joined this organization actually were more free speech than the organization itself or Charlie Kirk ever was. Like they actually had some principles about it and believed in it. And thought this is where I should be to have these conversations, when in reality, everything that it stood for and everything that he said countered that argument. But the kids at the universities may have taken it at face value, which, is good for the moment, I guess. But yeah, that's not what they stand for.
Which is not surprising at all. Young people are very principled. They tend to believe those types of arguments and take them at face value and say, look, like his whole brand is free speech. It was bullshit and it was a perverse twisting of the concept, but they just got here. They don't know that, but they do know that free speech is good. So they're like, I guess this is where I belong. It doesn't mean that's true. It doesn't mean that's actually where they belong. And it doesn't mean that they wouldn't have figured it out in the long run. But yeah, it's not surprising at all that young, idealistic people who genuinely believe in free speech would have gotten tricked by an organization claiming very loudly that that's what they were all about.
Yeah. And just a point, I don't want to go off the rails too much, but a point about debate too. What he was doing was not debating. And this is why I call his entity and organization a propaganda machine, because they were built with a goal to send a certain message. It didn't matter if the talking points or the data was real or factual. They were out there to push a message and to make sure that people thought they were winning every time they had a conversation or a back and forth with an 18-year-old college kid. And so that required using false data or, manipulated data at the very least, but mostly was just plain out false, and lying about the administration when they tried to defend what Trump's administration wanted to do, like bald-faced lying about it. And when they were called out, he didn't know how to respond because people had, occasionally trapped him in his own lies. And so just even the idea that we call this a debate, what he did is an impression, a loose impression of a debate. And even if you wanted to call it a debate, it was sort of trying to imitate what high schoolers and college kids do in debate club, which is not intellectually honest, because you are given, usually, here you argue this side, even if you don't believe this. And I understand the benefit of that as an exercise in intellectual conversation and debate. But when you are out there in public trying to, win in the marketplace of ideas, you are expected to be intellectually honest and not to just try to use the media and social media whirlwind to your favor to pull people in who don't really understand what's happening. This is not an actual conversation. Like, we are not having the social conversations we need to have. And of course, one of the reasons is because really what he wants to talk about is women are stupid and Black people don't deserve to be in jobs over white people. And like, that's not what we should be discussing. As Deon said earlier, and this is what I've also been saying for the last few weeks, like, you're not having a conversation about economic policy. Like, occasionally foreign policy would come up, and he couldn't argue Trump's foreign policy because there isn't one. It's chaos. That's not a policy. And so mostly it was about the culture war, social issues, because that is what drives people up emotionally. And so that's how you get views. And that's how you get people worked up enough to get a really crazy, angry clip that will go around the world on social media in a hot minute. So all of this was a performance, is the point, and not what should be expected as some bar of, free speech and honest debate.
Performance is close, but I was just about to propose a phrase to describe what he's doing that is something that is not debate. How about interactive marketing?
Yeah.
He reminds me of someone selling timeshares. You could argue, like, hey, we're just two people having a conversation about how you might want a vacation in the future. But in reality, the people selling the timeshares, or Charlie Kirk trying to sell Trumpism, had a whole toolbox of psychological tricks and framing devices to fool people into thinking that he was making better points than he was. And he would often conclude his conversations with, okay, so I got you to think a little bit differently on that. Would you consider voting for Trump now? Like he would go in for the sale at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And people would be like, "Oh, well, I mean, I do think something a little differently than I used to. Yeah, I get, you know." And then they'd like give him a MAGA hat, and everyone would clap. And like, it's it's a timeshare sales event, is what it
Yeah.
was. I mean, it's propaganda, it's marketing, it's all of that. It is not debate.
Yeah, he's a tool of the presidency. I mean, he looked up to him and Trump, liked him too. And all of that is about their personal relationship and has really nothing to do with the larger scale conversations that we desperately need to have in an honest way. Like, we really need to talk about some shit. It's none of the shit that he wanted to talk about with college kids on campuses.
Yeah. At the risk of belaboring the point, I just want to say, as many others have, his very last words on this earth were a bullshit framing device to trick people into thinking that gun deaths at the hands of gang members are not worth considering because gang members are less human than other people. Those were his last words. Like, having a discussion about gun violence in America and the rash of gun deaths and what should be done about it. And one of his bullshit framing devices was, well, are we talking about all gun deaths or can we separate out gangs? Fuck you, dude. No, you can't separate out gangs. Of course, are they human? Are the people in those gangs human? Do we want to talk about why people are in gangs? Do we want to talk about the context in which people live that results in them being in gangs? It's not because they're less human. We can start there. Yeah. So I'm agreeing with the frustration that he's being lionized for free speech because, I mean, it continues to sully the idea of what debate could be. And if that's what people imagine debates to be, then that portends nothing good. But getting back to the other general idea we were headed towards about Trump's attack on media, including Pam Bondi, which is how we got on Charlie Kirk. The article continues, Mr. Trump wasn't as nuanced on Tuesday when Jonathan Karl, a news correspondent from Mr. Kimmel's network, pressed him on Miss Bondi's comments and the implications for free speech. And Trump says, she'll probably go after people like you because you treat me so unfairly. You have a lot of hate in your heart. Maybe they will come after ABC, end quote. So the free speech lawyer is now going to like implement a ban on hate in your heart speech.
You didn't hear him say maybe and probably. So like that's a complete cover, and he isn't saying what you said he or even implied he was saying because he said maybe and probably. So if you were implying that he is using the government to attack people speaking, you're wrong because he said maybe and probably. And he does that all the time. It's so clear, but for some reason, I do think a lot of people hear maybe and probably and do give him the benefit of the doubt. I don't know why we're still doing that in 2025, but it seems to work. It's so frustrating with Trump. He says what he says. What happens is exactly what you thought was going to happen, but it can kind of like give him a little plausible deniability that that's not exactly what he was saying. You heard whatever. And that's maybe that's really free speech. It is free from meaning. It is free from anything that resembles what words mean. And he gets to get away with that. And I think it's very strange that people like you were talking about earlier, the principled college kids can't hear that. And maybe they don't hear that because all the media that they consume is owned by operations that launder all of his speech and make it seem like he is defending free speech and make it seem like they do care about that kind of stuff. I was thinking, like, this is the principle of actual debate. Like, if you lie in a debate, you lose. You can't tell lies. And while we're recording this, the government has just shut down. And J.D. Vance on the White House lawn said that the reason that the government is shut down is because Democrats want to give billions of dollars of free money to illegal immigrants for healthcare, which is a blatant, ridiculous lie. It's just not true. And when the government is plainly, openly lying, and the person that is lying also went on Charlie Kirk's podcast to say that, hey, if someone is saying bad things that you don't like about Charlie Kirk, call their employer.
When the vice president of the United States is saying that.
Exactly. The vice president of the United States. The whole government has weaponized speech to suppress the speech of anyone they disagree with. So we've got a whole operation that is explicitly, completely anti-free speech. And yet, some people just can't see it. And it's very frustrating.
Well, and just to clarify, I know that we're referencing J.D. Vance specifically saying that, but that is a talking point all of them are on board with about the money for healthcare for illegal aliens. That language, I can't not laugh at the word alien anyways. But yeah, I think Hegseth was on NBC or something also spouting that yesterday or the day before. So the apparatus is amazing, and him saying probably maybe is also him hiding behind Pam Bondi, because if shit goes awry, if it starts coming down on him, like he throws her under the bus, there will always be someone shielding him as well as using language that shields him. It's definitely layered.
Next up, just a couple of points that I thought were worth sharing from this other New York Times article. Headline, with Jimmy Kimmel's firing, the mask comes off. And there's this quote, but I really just want to get to the end of it. Numerous media reports suggest that the younger Mr. Ellison will install a new leader at CBS News, Bari Weiss, the former New York Times editor and writer who founded the Free Press, a particularly deft practitioner of the shell game politics of free speech, end quote. And I loved the phrase shell game politics related to free speech. Like it is so clear what that means. Like, it's a simple game, but it's an obvious trick. And the best way to play a shell game is to not play, because you know ahead of time that it's bullshit.
And that first article that we brought up, that this is actually worse than you think it is, the Bari Weiss being part of CBS, this is exactly why it's worse. There was a time in this country that, we've never been united. Let's get that out of the way. Like, this has never been a happy, friendly, kumbaya country. And ABC, NBC, CBS have never been completely unimpeachable sources of truth. However, they did have journalistic standards. They were, for the most part, telling a version of the truth, if not just the truth. And they were the source for the vast majority of people. So we all had, whether it was completely the truth, the unvarnished truth, of course not, but there was a unified source of information in this country for a long time. And now we are so fractured because of the internet, but there's this corporate control and the monetization of information and this consolidation. And now this major legacy brand of trusted news will be run by a propagandist. Like, it will be owned by someone who has a direct agenda to, I guess, just own everything. That's the goal for all of these people eventually, is just to own the planet. I'm not sure what the end goal is. Like, Amanda brought up, like, he's 81 years old, Larry Ellison. Like, he won the game of capitalism. He was the richest person in the world for like 3 days.
Yeah.
Like, he did it.
Yeah.
He won. But that's not enough. They have to carry this on and make sure that we all believe the nonsense that they believe. And in order to do that, they're, I think, knowingly lying. Maybe they all bought their own bullshit at this point. Maybe they don't know that they're lying. Who knows? But these are lies. And if your whole goal is to get someone to believe the way you believe, and you have to tell lies to get them to believe what you believe, maybe what you believe is wrong. And maybe you should reevaluate. And obviously that's not going to be what any of these people end up doing. They're going to continue to lie. But that's the weird part to me, that once you see that they are lying all the time, you have to start to reevaluate. Oh, why have I believed these lies? And I think that's where a lot of Trump people, Trump voters, Trump supporters are at this point. Like, they have swallowed so many lies that if they were to start seeing this part's a lie, this part's a lie, it unravels their whole worldview, and then they're just kind of lost. So we're getting to a point where the lie is just the norm, and people are just going to have to accept it. And it is scary that it is consolidating. It is going to be the main source of information in this country is just versions of Fox News. Fox News won. They got to lie for years and years, and now the other major news entities are just going to do what they do. And that's, I mean, what's the long-term effects of that going to be? Like, we already know what the long-term effects of Fox News are. Here we are. What's it going to be when MSNBC, well, whatever it is, MS Now, that isn't going to exist, but NBC, ABC, CBS are just Fox News. It's not going to be a fun country.
No. And, you know, we joked during the Bush administration about Fox News being state TV. And now it is, I mean, and it was back then, but it is full on state TV right now. Like, I think this is something that we all kind of know, but doesn't get said obviously very often. We are living in a country with a regime that has its own full blown propaganda network, messaging network. Like, Trump has state TV, and he doesn't just have one of them. He now has OAN and Newsmax. So, you know, in many ways, it's like, do you really need more? Like, those have been going okay for you. But of course, the goal, and I'm going to tie this back to something that Joy Reid said recently that has been going around. She had this monologue that is actually connected to a monologue she did on her show when she was on MSNBC a few years ago, where she talked about how the right desperately wants the culture. And this time around, she pointed out, you have everything. Why are you so angry? You have literally everything. And she goes through the list, and it is a long list. It's not just you have the White House and Congress and, you know, the Supreme Court. She goes through everything. And she's like, so why are you so mad? And at the end, what she comes to is, again, that same thing. Oh, you want us to like you. You want us to get on board and respect you in some way. You want us to invite you to the Oscars and, you know, like, totally embrace you. That is actually what this is about on like a deeper kind of emotional level for them. It's not enough to have won. That is not going to fix the hole in their heart. They need to conquer the left in the sense that they want us to say, oh, you were right. That's never going to happen. So unfortunately, we are going to go through the process of them desperately and aggressively and violently trying to bring us to heel. And if that means that eventually some people on the left just lie and say they like them or that they'll embrace them because they're scared, that's enough. That'll be enough. And that is what a totalitarian regime is. And that's when you've gotten to the point of complete and total control. And so you can never give in. No company, ABC, NBC, New York Times, Disney, nobody can give in. And they don't realize that yet. They don't realize that we're still at the point where you have to push back. They think we'll just play ball. This will be fine. No, we're at the line right now. You cross the line by acquiescing, by complying in advance. If you do that, there's no more chances.
Yeah, there's a line in one of these articles about how Trump, in another one of his lawsuits that he just launched, references back to, you know, ABC and whoever else decided to give in to him ahead of time, and references those saying, because they gave in to me, it means my arguments are meritorious.
Yep.
So when you give in, it's not just about you. It's you are giving momentum and like perceived or claimed legitimacy for Trump to continue doing the same thing to the next company and the next company and the next company. But so look, like, everyone is grasping for straws here, I think. And when you try to find positive angles, I think it's going to come up a little thin, but it's what we have at the moment. So this Times article goes on and has some thoughts about growing independent media. And I'm sort of curious what everyone thought of this. It says, as the former Twitter and other big social media platforms increasingly come under control of Trump-aligned ownership, that might be what saves us. Alternative journalism platforms, such as Substack, podcasts, the coming boom in low-cost AI-enabled video, a handful of studios like A24 and Neon that are still wedded to daring TV and film, dozens of small independent publications are sprouting up around the country and flexing their independence. And the growing number of TV journalists who have been fired or quit their legacy jobs after some disagreement or perceived infraction, Mehdi Hassan, Terry Moran, and Joy Reid come to mind, are gaining enough traction to begin to be considered a new kind of deconstructed TV network, end quote. And so, I mean, Deon, you were focusing on, we had Fox News, but now all the big networks are going to be Fox Newsified. But this is all happening in a moment where we're not just fractured politically, we're fractured by how we actually consume our news. And so the value and importance of legacy media is decreasing as time goes on, and being able to be effective through the new channels by which younger people get their news, which is not cable news at all, is becoming more important. And so how that balance shakes out is going to be interesting, obviously, but there's something there. Like maybe it's worthwhile to consider that list that, like, well, there's all these independent companies and legitimate mainstream journalists going independent is kind of, it's shaking things up a little bit. And not that long ago, I would have said, like, right, they're just in the wilderness now. What's the big deal about that? But like, as we get further and further away from the big three era of Cronkite and everyone consuming the same semi-truthful news, everything's getting shuffled. So there might be something there.
I like agree with pieces of that, especially, I mean, the consolidation of media companies concerns me less than the purchase of TikTok. That to me
right.
feels
Mhm.
like very dominating, very worrisome, just because there aren't a lot of social media platforms that can compete.
Yeah. Look what happened to Twitter.
Yeah. And we've definitely tried to get some off the ground, do alternative social media, but it just doesn't have the same pull. I'm not saying it's not possible. I really feel like it's more subtle, the curations. Like you'll have people talk about it, but when you start banning content, when you start adjusting algorithms, and we don't have investigative reporters or the funding to do that, reporting, it is very worrisome for me. So I like that idea of the growing independent media. I think that's what's going to get us through. I think there will always be the resistance channel, but is it actually going to be able to cross over into like mainstream where I can see my mom going on Substack? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the other problem, of course, is that if you're operating on the same channels and mediums as the right and the channels that the right owns, then yeah, you're going to have a real tough time reaching people because you're going to be suppressed or not allowed. I mean, that's probably coming very soon. So, as soon as Elon Musk bought Twitter and said he was going to let everybody back on and it's a free for all, he started banning people for making fun of him. So like, they're not consistent. They don't care about being hypocritical. And so where do we exist is part of that problem that we have to face. And yeah, new entities can be built. There are certainly smart and savvy coders and developers and people with great ideas coming from the left. But then you got to build that outside the country, I guess, because how else will you do it in a situation where businesses have to be in bed with the regime or you're out? It is not going to be easy. It is going to be a big, big struggle, but I actually see all this coming from outside. Like I see the possibility for journalists who are now independent going to work for places like the BBC or, some other outside country news and covering from beyond. Like that probably is going to happen more and more as things get worse.
So next up, we have this sort of educational story. I said before that we were going to get to Russia in a little bit more detail. So the New Yorker has this article, Trump's attacks on media following Putin's playbook, ? And so there's just this story towards the top. It says, in 2000, NTV, a Russian television channel known for its independent muckraking coverage, was among the country's most watched stations. The evening news reported on atrocities committed by Russian forces in Chechnya and on corruption schemes that implicated top officials in the Kremlin. Its correspondents had looked into the possibility that the FSB, the successor agency to the KGB, was behind a series of mysterious apartment bombings that helped solidify Putin's power. That May, days after Vladimir Putin was inaugurated to his first term as Russia's president, a high-ranking Kremlin official conveyed a list of demands to NTV. If the channel hoped to survive, the official said, it must end its investigations into corruption in Putin's entourage, abandon its unflinching coverage of the war in Chechnya, and more readily coordinate its editorial policy with the Kremlin. Before long, a media holding company of the Russian state energy giant Gazprom took a majority stake in the channel, ending its independence and giving the Kremlin decisive influence over its editorial policy, end quote. Which is why we were making the comparisons to Russia back when we were talking about Ellison buying TikTok and other channels. Like, that is what the oligarchs are for. Gazprom is a state company, either previously owned or controlled by Russian oligarchs in line with Putin. That's the whole mechanism right there. And so they go through more details about the ins and outs of how media was manipulated in Russia and sort of like how sad it was to see.
Yeah, that's the part that got me.
Yeah, one of the people who worked at that station said, at first, Putin wasn't strong enough to defeat everyone. He was far from omnipotent, but by bending to him, they participated in creating what over time became his aura of unchecked power, referring to the station, eventually bending to Putin's will. And so that is the type of story that needs to be told right now to anyone in positions of power within these corporations. Because, I mean, we could argue that these corporations shouldn't have as much power as they do, but they do. And so we really are at a pivot point where things could go downhill quickly or there can be resistance. And it is incredibly important that those corporations do what's right for the entire country right now, not for their next quarter's earnings.
Can I just say how unbelievably infuriating it is that we have to depend on CEOs of giant corporations to be the defenders of democracy? I am fucking enraged by that. Of all the people who I would want to be the ones on the line, they're down at the count when things really matter, like the CEOs of corporations aren't who I would have picked. And unfortunately, that is where we are. Does anyone trust any of these people to do the right thing as far as you can throw them? I mean, Disney only caved because people responded, and that is the lesson. The lesson is people have to respond, but you can't, like Disney, there's a direct line there to customers. There are other entities that won't have that same mechanism in place, and I just can't believe that's who's holding the line.
And that's why the antidote to fascism is definitely not capitalism. It's democracy. And in capitalism, in these corporate structures, there is no democracy. We do not have democracy in our workplace. And the solution to that would be socialism. We need a more egalitarian workplace where workers have say so, where the CEO, who has wildly different interests and goals in what a company does than the average worker, is not the only say so. We're watching it happen over and over again because ultimately going towards Trump is right now the financially responsible thing to do for the bottom line. Fighting against Trump, you get the government against you, you get regulations for, all the stuff you've been doing wrong all this time that you probably should have been regulated for in any way. They're not going to do the right thing. They're going to do the thing that makes them the most money. And if
Yep.
that's all we're relying on, we are in trouble. I've been thinking of lately this analogy, playing tug of war, like the Democratic Party specifically. We're playing tug of war, and the Democratic Party's strategy over the last, I don't know, 40, 50 years has been not to pull harder to their side, has been, let's give them some slack. Let's just give them some slack.
Yeah.
And give them some slack. And now we're at the center line where we could all be pulled over to the other side because they've just been giving them slack instead of pulling. And tug of war instead of actual war. The right has done a much better job of pushing things a little bit to the right, holding firm, pulling things a little bit further to the right,
Yep.
hold firm for a little bit, and over and over and over again, this ratcheting effect that never goes the other way. And I think we'll get into this a little later, but like Ezra Klein, his suggestion to the Democratic Party is to give a little more slack.
Yeah.
And like, how we ever get to a point where we don't have fascism, authoritarianism, and we keep giving a little bit more to them, it's not going to work that way. It never will work that way. And it's time to keep pulling. And we need to pull in a lot of different places, and our workplace is a huge part of it. Having CEOs be the rulers of the country is a terrible idea.
I just want to point out that the connection between the two things you both said, Amanda and Deon, is that is what neoliberalism brings you. When the market is allowed to do whatever it wants and the government totally gets out of the game of regulation or breaking up monopolies, you end up having no real power in government because government has depowered itself to make real change. And so for years, like pre-Trump, people have felt like campaigns targeting corporations was some of their best actions they could take politically. Politically, to make change, activists would target corporations, not the government, because they know the government's not going to do anything. We can't change their minds. We can't get them to take action. So let's go to plan B and we'll try to target corporations directly. So we've already been in this space for a long time, and this is the end game of it. And that dovetails perfectly with Deon's point as well. It's like, we don't actually have democracy, and we haven't for a long time. We've had various versions of corporatocracy and oligarchy where people aren't able to impact the government. And as employees of corporations, we're definitely not able to impact corporations. Like, it's not, they don't pretend like it's democracy inside a corporation. And all of these things are linked. It's not complicated.
Unionize. But so talking about this, I know we've done a lot of specifically talking about the coverage, but it reminded me of an AP article I read about Hungary where they were talking about just the coverage of elections and how the time that they're allotted, every 4 years is like 5 minutes, which is like the minimum by whatever laws or governance that they have. But what does the consolidation look like when we talk about presidential debates? I know it feels like a long way off, but I mean, that is a looming threat of how are we ever going to get out of this? Like, we're losing the day-to-day narrative if all of the news coverage is going to go soft on whatever we want to call this government. But also, like, what does it look like to be able to change that if our politicians who are running against whomever, like, this is such a dicey thing to talk about, I guess, because, who's going to run for the Republican Party? A lot of questions. But what does that look
Well,
like?
it'll be Trump or Trump's ghost.
I mean, I didn't want to put
Right.
that out there, but yeah, what does it look like for Democrats to actually have a podium to stand behind, to actually be able to make their case to the American people, and not just day to day, but literally when they're in the campaign?
So on Trump, like, I noted Trump's lack of subtlety before in how he approaches attacking the media, which I think might be relevant. So this article continues about Russia. In the case of NTV, the Kremlin went to great lengths to present the affair as a, quote, dispute between business entities, as the terminology went. Trump, for his part, has been open about settling political scores. In the wake of Kimmel's suspension, he said of television networks that air negative coverage of him, quote, they'll take a great story and they'll make it bad, adding, quote, "I think that's really illegal." There was little subtlety in his threats, and he continued saying, quote, "I would think maybe their license should be taken away," end quote. So Trump being so explicit about his plans may partly be a strategy to help move the Overton window towards authoritarianism and sort of normalizes those ideas. But I think it also makes that shift much more fragile. At the core of politics, the argument for incrementalism, going slowly, is that it makes your changes more reliably solid. If you change things too fast and it freaks people out, the backlash could be huge. There could be demands to go backward. But if you go really slowly, then people have time to get used to it. And when change is made, it usually sticks. You can have arguments, on all kinds of topics about the best paths forward, but fast tracking authoritarianism is a good way to make that authoritarianism fragile, because the backlash is currently swift and harsh. People do rise up. And when he says it as explicitly as he does, that doesn't do anything but help people make the point that we need to undo what he is doing. It gives a platform for his opposition to stand on the idea that we need to not just go back, but we need to reinvent some of the safeguards that we either had and lost or have never had but now need, that could be implemented to stop what he is doing right now. And the fact that he's not being subtle about it makes that argument easier.
I hope so. It should. It should.
While keeping the hope train going, New York Magazine wrote the article, "Trump is going to lose the war on free speech," sort of comparing the current attempts to squash left-wing speech to past examples. This writer says, quote, "The moral panics of the 20th century, for all their vileness, had genuine backing across the culture. There was widespread anti-communist mania that fueled the Red Scare and made red baiters like Richard Nixon into major political and cultural figures. After September 11th, George W. Bush enjoyed an approval rating north of 90%, and anti-war dissidents were forcibly suppressed as many Americans cheered on new invasions. The specter of another mass casualty terrorist attack was the Bush administration's justification for the Patriot Act, Guantanamo Bay, and spying on American citizens. Trump has no comparable emergency to gesture towards, and Republicans, utterly subservient to his whims, are glad to dispense with the illusion they ever cared about free speech." The point being, what he is doing is deeply unpopular, and he is super clear about what he is doing. And so we managed to overcome those past moral panics, as was described in the article, even though they were incredibly popular at the time. And this isn't even popular. He doesn't have any excuse for what he's doing, and the vast majority of people hate it. And so the possibility for the backlash to be swift and strong is as possible as with any other need to push back on terrible policies as we've had in the recent past.
I think a small upside of all this, too, is that Trump himself is a victim to all this propaganda. You can tell in interviews multiple times he'll be asking questions that are unrelated to the subject at hand because he doesn't really know what's going on. He'll say to his advisors that he's heard something different. Like, he recently talked to the mayor in Portland and was kind of surprised that Portland isn't in the middle of burning down, because that's what his advisors are telling him. So
showing him
he
2020 footage.
Yeah, he doesn't have real information, and he's making decisions based on false information. They're all lying to each other all the time, and it's just this snake eating its own tail, and eventually it's going to get to the head, and it's going to eat itself. Like, fascism doesn't work. Fascism has never worked. I mean, it's a self-defeating ideology. It's a death cult. It will kill itself. The problem, of course, is it wants to kill a lot of other things in the meantime. But luckily, this group is even stupider than the last groups of fascists that have tried this throughout history. So maybe it'll burn out faster, because they are all really, really dumb.
And to be fair and balanced, because I bring up the Babylon Bee and I sometimes read articles that they like have said interesting and thoughtful things. I just want to be fair and also read when they're fucking terrible. And so they recently had the headline, "We don't need help against Antifa, announces Portland mayor currently on fire."
Yeah. Good try, guys.
See, the joke is that Portland is on fire. Like, it's not. It isn't. The joke is, isn't it fun to pretend that it is so that we can send in the military to kill Americans? That's the funny part.
Also, Portland is killing it right now. They are dressed in the weirdest costumes they got.
Horrible choice of
and
words,
just
Amanda.
dancing around, having a Victorian tea party in front of some ICE agents, wearing a full-on like pink Pokemon blow-up suit. They are doing it right. I think that is the best form of protest I've seen so far. So, shout out.
Going back to that Russia thing, the NTV, the takeover by Gazprom, and basically just Putin. There was a show on there that had puppets, kind of a political puppet show, and then it had a puppet of Putin that drove Putin crazy.
Yeah,
apparently, he
didn't like
hated
that.
it. He did not like to be mocked, and Putin is a little more strategic thinker, but he still like that got him, and it's not any different than going after Colbert and Kimmel. Trump hates to be, well, not even mocked, but shown to be who he is. He hates that more than anything. And that I do think there's some limitation to like political comedy, but pisses him off and makes him do stupid things strategically. I'm all for it.
Mm-hmm.
So just to read the last bit of this article, it says, quote, "A MAGA regime will run the country for at least 3 more years, but they will never have organic support from the culture again. They have been exposed for what they are, sniveling would-be commissars longing for a dystopia they will never, no matter how hard they try, be able to build. They can't trick young people into backing the Israeli government or treating Kirk like Martin Luther King Jr. They can't make all media into MAGA propagandists. Their wrath, if unnerving, is ultimately pathetic." End quote. And I appreciate when people call out the pathetic nature of what this movement is. And I mean, it gets said a lot, and it's worth repeating a lot that fascism, authoritarian movements are fragile. They're brittle. They seem hard, but are actually easy to crack because the people in them are dumb. They are easy to goad into making mistakes. And so all you have to do is not fall for it. It's harder than it sounds, but not impossible.
I'm like super delightful. So my hope note to my wife is usually like, inevitably by the time we're old, we will no longer live under fascism. Like it might take 20 to 30 years, but like eventually we won't live like that. She's like, "Thanks, babe. That feels really great." It is a hope note for me though. I mean, you got to hold on to whatever.
You do. And on that note, Erin, I was just watching videos from the Global Sumud Flotilla going to Gaza last night, and unfortunately they've been intercepted. But I was watching this singer-songwriter that I've been following for a while, Carsey Blanton. She's huge. I'm sure other people are aware of her. And she is on the flotilla. And she sang a song that I was not familiar with. And it's an old 60s folk song by Malvina Reynolds. And it's called "God Bless the Grass." And I'm hoping right here I can just put in the video of her playing it because it's really good.
God bless the grass that grows through the crack. They roll the concrete over it and try to hold it back, but the concrete gets tired of what it has to do. It breaks and it buckles and the grass grows through. God bless the truth that fights toward the sun. They roll the lies over it and think that it's done, but it moves through and reaches for the end. And after a while, it is growing dead.
It's a very simple little song, but it had some lyrics in there that actually made me feel better than anything I've read for a while now. So I'll share it.
There are a lot of signs that what we're going through right now is the death throes of old, tired, terrible ideas. They do seem like they're strong right now, but like, Jay just said, it's strong because it's a dog barking that is actually terrified. It could hurt you and it probably will do some damage, but it's weak. These are just weak, worn out ideas. The rest of the world is moving on without America. If we want to be relevant in the world again, we got to get rid of all this stuff. All this stuff is the problem. I think eventually there will be people who think, we don't want to just put up a wall around the entire country and not be affiliated with anybody else in the world. I think farmers in America, especially soybean farmers who just discovered that China has bought 0 soybeans this time around, and it was responsible for $12 billion of their income. So it went from $12 billion to $0.
Because we bailed out Argentina.
Yeah. We gave Argentina $20 billion. There are people who are realizing that this is not working for us. And it is people who in the past would not have been able to be reached because it's affecting them personally. But when enough people are affected personally by policies that they thought would help them, they are forced to rethink. Maybe they're not going to come to our side. Maybe they're not going to be woke. There's not going to be a lot of woke soybean farmers. But they might see that voting for Trump and voting strictly on, I don't want to just say racism, but I don't want to not say that either. But voting just for that is self-defeating. It may make you feel good in the moment, but it's going to hurt you in the long run. This country, this is the most patriotic thing I'm ever going to say. We have all the building blocks to actually be the greatest country in the world. We never have been, but we've got all the stuff. We've got all the people. We've got all the cultures. We've got all the building blocks to actually make it the thing that people have been talking about my whole life. It's all there, but there's also a lot of roadblocks to it. The roadblocks being white supremacy, sexism, colonialism, capitalism. There are major stumbling blocks to this, but all the building blocks to actually make it a better place, they exist.
And that's why you're progressive. And that's why we all are in the style of abolitionists before us who believe this place could be what they said it was going to be.
What was promised.
Yeah.
There was a quote in one of these articles today from FCC Chairman Brendan Carr that sort of caught my eye. The article says, Mr. Carr noted that his agency had walked away from enforcing that public interest obligation, but told Mr. Hannity, I guess he was being interviewed on Fox, that was now changing. Quote, we at the FCC are going to enforce the public interest obligation, he said. If there's broadcasters out there that don't like it, they can turn their license in, end quote. And I read that and thought of a lot more than just the FCC and thought of the shifting of politics right now. Like for a Republican appointee to say that we are going to use government and not do like the neoliberal laissez-faire, let business do what it wants to do, but take real action. Obviously taking action that's horrible and oppressive and in line with authoritarian goals, but take real action, not just let capitalism run its course. That is really indicative of the shift in politics we're experiencing. We talked today about the context that neoliberalism has put us in, the context that means that government has been totally ineffectual for decades, that the only place where we feel like we might get any recourse is if we protest corporations directly. Now we're like hoping and holding on by the skin of our fingers that corporate CEOs will come and save us. That is where our politics of the last few decades has brought us. And it is widespread across the spectrum, right and left, even for those who can't quite put it into words or don't know how to describe it. But everyone is super dissatisfied with politics and was in a recent episode of Best of Left that huge numbers of people, not just in the US, but in other countries, huge numbers of people do not think that life will be better 10 years from now. And like those numbers are usually not high. And those are indicative of the idea that politics is not delivering. And so people are ready to experiment. They're ready to break out of what we have been doing in the past. And so someone like Brendan Carr saying that the FCC is going to become activist, to me means imagine what the left could do. Eventually, the left will be in power again. And we need to be ready with plans for how to be an activist government again. We haven't been for a really long time. I mean, Democrats at best have been sort of a like, let's maintain the status quo because everything's pretty good and don't worry about it. And we'll tweak things around the edges. It's been a long time since we took big swings to really change things for people, really benefit people, and use the power of government to serve the needs of people. And society and the media landscape, everything we've been talking about today, is so different now than the last time we had an activist left-wing government that we are overdue to readjust to the new landscape. I mean, there are media concepts that exist now that did not exist then. Obviously, we need a new set of rules to live by, and we are a long way away from like implementing good new rules. And obviously now we have an authoritarian government that will either do nothing, let capitalism do what it's going to do with no regulation, no fear of mergers not going through as long as you pay the authoritarian toll. But the left could come in and do something other than just defend the status quo, which feels alien to me as someone in my 40s. I didn't live in a world in which the Democratic Party actually fought for something other than the status quo, but it could happen. And arguably, we're in a tipping point of shifting politics where it is more likely than not that the next Democrat to get elected will have that sort of ideology in mind. Because if they don't, they're not going to get elected. Any Democrat running who's like, let's go back to the status quo, crickets, not going to get elected. So maybe it'll be a while, but the next Democrat to win will be ready to make serious changes. I'm not talking about like equal and opposite, like, well, if the Republicans want to censor left-wing speech, then we should do the same. More like this. I found this article this week. Common Dreams wrote, top human rights groups make case for countries to break up big tech. And it goes on and says specifically, one of the world's leading human rights groups, Amnesty International, is calling on governments worldwide to break up with big tech by reining in the growing influence of tech and social media giants. A report published Thursday by Amnesty highlights 5 tech companies it describes as digital landlords who determine the shape and form of our online interaction. These 5 companies collectively have billions of active users, which the report says makes them akin to utility providers. So the way a muscular left-wing government, no longer content to just let the market have its way, would approach the new generation of information transmission will be very, very different from a right-wing government, particularly an authoritarian one. And as I said, we really need to be ready to take action on those kinds of issues when the roles are eventually reversed. Because status quo brought us here, and Trump is only enacting a plan to make it worse in a way that is almost universally hated. And so we need to use the power of the backlash and our shifting politics to empower a muscular left-wing government that's ready to use the power of government for the benefit of the people. Did we solve it?
Working towards something that maybe long-term could be useful.
I think we solved it. All right. If you have any thoughts on how to empower the backlash and have it be as swift and powerful as possible, send us a message at 202-999-3991. You can do a voicemail or text message there. You can send an email to me at j@bestofleft.com. or reach us on Signal at bestofleft.01. Thanks for listening, and remember that all of this is really happening, so continue to be decent, act like what you do and say matters, and do what matters most.